I spoke with renowned cognitive neuroscientist Professor Floris de Lange. Floris studies the brain processes behind perception and decision-making. Interestingly, he did his postdoc with Professor Stanislas Dehaene, who developed a very famous theory of human consciousness called global neuronal workspace theory. In this conversation with Floris, I tried to understand how human perception works, how actually we make decisions. It was really interesting to learn about the role of curiosity in our decision-making process. And I was curious to understand, how we can translate human curiosity to machines. And of course, we discussed his take on consciousness and whether consciousness can emerge in machines. Throughout your work, what is the profound insight that you learned about, human perception that fascinated you, if there is any?
One of the things that I find that I'm quite compelled by, and that I find so quite amazing, is this is the fact that prediction is not just something that we can do, but that it seems to some degree that it is something that we're doing all the time, even when we're not aware of it, and when we don't feel like as an agent that we are making predictions. So, and one of the more recent experiments that we did, where we found this as well, is actually not in the realm of perception, but more in the realm of language, where Misha Helbron, he was a former student in my lab. He had people just listen to an audiobook, which was just a nice story, basically, that they listened to. And then what he did is he quantified really for every word in the audiobook how predictable that word was using a large language model. So that's also really where AI came to the rescue again. Using that approach, he could really show that people seem to predict really all the time when they're listening to a story, each and every word, and then not only its meaning, but also kind of the other surface properties of the language, like syntax and phonological features. So that's something that that I found quite compelling and quite interesting, that this process of prediction seems to be really integral to the functioning of our brain. And in that sense, I was also found it interesting that sort of the large language models that are now so successful in, you could say, capturing all the statistical regularities that are there in all the text that we produce, that those also have this extremely simple objective function, right? It's all the pre-learning is based on a next token prediction. So I find that quite an interesting parallel there.
So just to clarify, so basically when people were listening those stories, they were trying to predict what will happen next in that story, or what?
The people themselves were just asked to listen to and enjoy the audiobook. So they were not asked to predict anything. But what we did there is we measured their brain activity while they were doing that. And then what we could do is simply look at the amount of neural activity elicited by each word in the audiobook, and see how well that activity could be described as a function of how predictable each and every word in the audiobook was. And there we saw a strong correlation, so that the amount of activity elicited by a word was very strongly related to how predictable that word was given the preceding context.
Consciously, they weren't put an effort to make predictions, but their brain, the activity of their brain suggested that it was trying to predict next word in that story.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Not how story will evolve.
Well, that might be part of it.
But the word that might be used in that story.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I mean, I'm sure that people make predictions at all kind of time scales here as well, and some of them they may be making consciously. Indeed, along the lines of I'm curious what's going to happen next. I'm curious whether the protagonist, what he's going to do next, etc. So I'm sure that people also make those kind of predictions, but also at much kind of one could say more fine-grained levels of what is the next phoneme that I'm going to listen to, or what is the next syntactic structure that I'm going to experience. all those kind of predictions also were visible in the brain activity.
Would it be correct to say that now I'm listening to you and my brain, if we now look at the activity of my brain is trying to predict what next word you will tell me?
Yeah, I would be, I think that would be correct.
But actually, I don't know what word you will, I mean, in some cases, I might infer what word you will say, like what you will respond. But I guess in many cases, I don't know what word you will say. Is it like attempt of the brain to predict next word?
Yeah, so for sure, you will not always be perfectly able to predict what I'll say next. I mean, if that would be the case, I wouldn't be conveying any information also, right? I mean, so in that sense, I think there's this kind of interesting tension between sort of a speaker trying to actually provide information, which is in a sense kind of maximize the surprise of the listener, and the listener trying to do exactly the opposite, like trying to reduce uncertainty and predict what the speaker is saying. But now, so for sure, you will not be able to predict exactly everything at all the time. But there are these kind of moment-to-moment fluctuations in how predictable things are. Right? Like as the sentence unfolds, things become more predictable. That's just one example. And also, even though you cannot always predict exact lexical items, you can often sort of predict something in a little broader level, like the sort of the semantic, content of the words, for example. Yeah.
Actually, I recently spoke with Carl Friston, and we were discussing the minimizing surprise that we're trying to, through curiosity, right? Trying to minimize our surprises. Basically, your work through those experiments actually proves that the active inference framework, right? So that basically our brain is a like prediction machine that tries to minimize surprise about the world.
No, I think definitely in broad terms, I fully agree with that framework, and I think it's that the data are indeed consistent with it. I think, of course, at a finer scale, active inference is one specific proposal. I think there is still a lot of details to be sort of determined with respect to, for example, what exactly the form is of our predictions, to which level of granularity is our brain trying to predict input, the role indeed also of the of action in this. I think there are still several flavors on the table, but I think the general gist, I think the data are indeed fully in line with that notion that Carl Friston also puts out.
What is our current knowledge about to what like granularity like our brain tries to predict? I'm just like curious, like to what scale it goes.
That's an interesting question. Yeah, no, and I think that there's really quite a bit of debate about that still. I mean, what we are finding in some more recent experiments is that the brain might actually form predictions at a fairly, or sometimes might form predictions at a fairly high level of abstraction. Again, linking it back to AI, this is also in a way what some models like JPA, for example, by Jan LeCun, are putting on the table. So that this is in the context of sort of more dynamic visual prediction, that it doesn't really make sense to predict pixels. In that sense, vision there is a little bit different from language, perhaps. Because language is much lower dimensional, I think, compared to vision, where you just have like massive amounts of possible pixel configurations. So there it may make a lot more sense to not predict sort of specific visual patterns, but rather sort of like to try to predict sort of the latents, the causes that cause those patterns. And that's, I think, also what some of the work that we have been doing recently seems to kind of provide empirical evidence for.
To summarize, like we're doing this more abstract predictions.
Yeah, so indeed, if you would be, let's say, open the door of your house, you would not kind of like have a prediction of a photograph of the hallway or the coat rack, etc., but rather it would be more sort of akin to, to activating in your mind sort of the causes, like coat rack, hallway, etc., that would generate certain visual inputs.
So if we make the parallels with AI, like in LLMs, it's literally predicting next word, but like for human brain, it's more like predicting, like as you mentioned earlier, like semantics of the word, right? It's like more abstract than like this, like concrete, like what will be the next word.
Yeah, I don't think that we that the LLMs would be a good mechanistic model for how we predict during language comprehension. They're a very nice tool, so you can use them very nicely to get an fairly accurate probability distribution over words. So you can feed an LLM with some context and then basically ask it, okay, tell me what is the next word going to be? And then it will give you sort of a nice distribution of all words, and you can use that to kind of then calculate some things like information theoretic surprisal or entropy. But I don't think by any means the brain has kind of like a list of all the words in the lexicon that it kind of activates proportionally to how probable it thinks those words are. That would be, that would absolutely not work.
Could you think of any examples where that basically our brain tries to predict, like kind of plays tricks on us, that it kind of backfires to some extent? I don't know, maybe it is hallucination, but just like that error, like the examples of error that happen in life, that, you know, maybe overpredicted something.
Yeah, no, I think that happens. I think those things happen a lot in a way that, well, I think maybe one, although that's maybe a bit of an abstract one. I mean, I think one of the tricks that the mind plays on us is that it kind of gives us this impression that we see everything all the time, right? Whereas in reality, we are rather limited in what we see at any moment in time. So we have like, if you put your thumb out sort of like in front of you, sort of like the area of the thumb is more or less the area where you get high fidelity input. And all of the rest is basically, your brain sort of filling in your perceptual experience with what you saw before. It's sort of like a memory trick, if you will. So that's, I think, kind of like an interesting trick that our brain plays on us, at least of how our conscious experience appears much richer than it really is. And there's all kind of experiments that show that quite nicely, like things like change blindness or inattentional blindness. There's all these kind of fun experiments. When it comes to perception or sort of like interpretation of input, well, there, I think, many of the visual illusions that we have, like Muller-Lyer illusion, where we see like lines of being very different length, even though they're not, etc. I think all of those are kind of like tricks that, in this case, the brain is kind of using cues to form an educated guess about what is in front of us. And those educated guesses are usually really good. That's why they're educated. But if you come up with these kind of like funny stimuli, like in the Muller-Lyer illusion, then they lead us astray, and then we're tricked. The hollow mask illusion is another one where we just cannot help but perceive the hollow mask as a face, basically, rather than the mask, the back of a mask. We are unable to see that, and I think all of those things are due to this process.
What, from our understanding of like human perception, what we could potentially translate to, advanced AI systems? You mentioned JEPA models is like one of the attempts, as I understand, right, to bring more this abstract prediction. Do you have other like thoughts how we potentially could translate that, what we know about human perception, to AI?
I mean, I think in the past this has happened to some extent already, right? I think the AlexNet, the first kind of convolutional neural network, was and the neocognitron before it were kind of all quite heavily inspired by neuroscience. So there, I think we have some success stories from the past. So predicting the future is, of course, always harder. But I think one thing that comes to mind is that we sample the environment very differently from AI at the moment, at least the AI system that I'm aware of. So as I was telling also previously, so we don't take in the entire scene, right? We take in only like very small portions of the scene by moving our eyes sort of several times a second. And some people have kind of always viewed this as a limitation or as a bug, so that we just have a capacity limitation. But I think it may actually much more be a feature than a bug. I think what it allows you to do is to already limit the complexity of the input or reduce the complexity of the input at the input stage, or the complexity of the signal at the input stage, as I say. So it allows us to sort of focus our thoughts on just a few things that matter to us at that moment and apply sort of attention already at the input. And I think that's a rather smart trick that humans and other species have incorporated in their machinery, so that this kind of active sampling rather than just taking everything in and trying to make sense of it. And that seems to me like maybe it's something that machine learning or AI could also capitalize on. I mean, there is of course attention mechanisms now in transformer architectures, etc. But that's really on when the input is already kind of all in there. So I think particularly in the realm of vision, I think it could be interesting to see whether sort of like limiting the input or degrading maybe a peripheral input and then sequentially sampling it, whether that would be helpful. But in general, I should say that perception is actually one of the success stories of AI, right? Together with language. So I think AI nowadays can categorize images better than humans. So maybe one other thing. Now I think of it. I think one other aspect where I think this struggle is to kind of go beyond categorization and to really understand why certain things are happening in the visual input. So, for example, when you're seeing a video of a glass that is falling on the ground, so why does the glass fall down rather than up? Why does it break upon impact? Or why do objects not go through each other? And there are things like object constancy. And that's, I think, another field where neuroscience and cognitive science has quite interesting ideas. People like Josh Tannenbaum have worked a lot on this. Stallman as well. Yeah, so there's many researchers that look at things like intuitive physics, and they have this idea that we have some kind of internal model of how things work, sort of how things behave and how things interact. And this is something, I think these models are brought to bear on our perception. And that's something that AI, I think, models of perception are usually not doing. They are much more of the kind of discriminative sense or feed-forward machines that just simple input-output mappings, or not simple, very complex input-output mappings. But I think given that the ambiguity and context dependence in the signal, you may gain a lot still by having a more of a sort of like a recurrent architecture where you're trying to actually really understand the input rather than just classify it.
About AI, like you mentioned that it's like feed forward, but there's also backpropagation, right? And that actually when they, with backprop algorithm, actually AI models started like performing much better. So like that feedback loop, right, also like shows that it also works well in AI systems.
So conventional, or let's say even systems that I would refer to as a feed-forward architecture, like AlexNet, or so those systems. You're absolutely right that when they are trained using error backpropagation. So there is this gradient descent using feedback. But that's really only during the training phase. So after they are, after they have had their training regime, all the way to frozen, and from that moment on, there is no feedback anymore. So from that moment on, it becomes a completely feed-forward architecture.
Yeah, basically we're entering into this like so-called continual learning problem, right? That currently active research.
No, for sure.
Yes.
You have, of course, also recurrent neural networks or networks that have feedback. And indeed, in my lab, we also played around with that a little bit. So we downloaded a neural network that was which is called CoreNet. This is a network that Jim DiCarlo's lab has developed. And at its bare bones, it's a very simple feed-forward neural network that just has a bunch of convolutional layers and then a fully connected layer. and then, but you can add feedback to that network, and also in CoreNet there are certain types of feedback that are already implemented. But then what you can do is either turn on the feedback or not, and see how it changes kind of the behavior and the neural representations of the network. But you can also, for example, train feedback with different objective functions or different loss functions. And that, I think, is a really interesting way in which we can use AI nowadays as well. So not to just get a really good classification performance or anything like that, but as a model organism, if you will. So as a different kind of animal that you can feed different inputs, or you can lesion part of the network, etc. So all of that is now possible with these kind of models. So the model that we downloaded a model, or so the base model that we used is a model that is already quite old, and it's not a very powerful model, but it is kind of like a model that it has some neural plausibility, one might say. And this is called CoreNet, like CORNET. That's from the Ricardo lab. But we are using it in a way a bit as a toy model. So it's not meant as a kind of like a accurate description of the brain, of course. A toy model of a visual perceptual module that gets input and then transforms it into sort of like a more categorical output. So we train it to kind of differentiate between 100 classes of different objects. And then we added sort of like different types of feedback connections to that model to kind of see how that then changes both how the model behaves. Particularly, we're interested in how it becomes less or more tolerant to noise, and also sort of like how it kind of looks then under the hood. So like how the representations are changed by these different types of feedback.
So it's not like transformer-based model.
No, this is a CNN-based model.
A neural network.
Even like the Swift AlexNet, one could say, which is a dinosaur of a model, right? That came out in 2000.
So interesting that people still use this kind of models.
So also for language, the model that we used there is a GPT-2 XL, which is it's a trivially small model when you compare it to the current state of the art. But for us, that's actually like that's an advantage rather than a disadvantage. So because we are not interested in the most powerful model or the model that that has the most parameters, but we're interested in trying to understand sort of how things work, right? So we're trying to understand the principles of the system, and then in the case of GPT-2 XL, the reason why we prefer that over like bigger and newer models is that they predict human behavior better. So when you look at things like reading time or looking time, or several groups have shown that those can be quite well predicted from surprisal estimates from GPT-2 XL, but they are not so well predicted anymore by these kind of like bigger and bigger models. And that might be partly because those models have completely soaked up all the texts that they would later be presented with, so that they're not at all surprised anymore by this text. But also just because their predictive capacity is basically no longer aligned with the predictive capacity of humans. That's why, there we don't really fancy the biggest models. And I think for vision, if you have a model that has only a few convolutional layers, it just kind of simplifies the problem. And we found that there is quite a nice correspondence between sort of the activity geometry in an early layer of, let's say, AlexNet, and the geometry that we find in early visual cortex, like V1 that we talked about earlier. And quite nice similarity between later layers of AlexNet, like the fully connected layers, and more categorical visual regions in the ventral visual stream. So there, it's just a pretty useful model, and we wouldn't gain anything by having like a model that has 50 or 100 layers.
What is your next ambition in terms of understanding human perception? What mysteries you want to solve?
I can mention a few that I think. So one thing that I've become more interested in is something that is not maybe necessarily perceptual, but it does have a strong impact on our perception as well, which is curiosity. So you already mentioned this term, and then and that that this is an important ingredient. And I think I totally agree. So I think curiosity is something that has been a bit neglected in cognitive science as well. So this is an area of research that I'm started working on a bit more. I think the first question there might already be like, what is curiosity really? How can you define this? I think many people define it a little bit as exploration behavior. And exploration, I think, is indeed very important because it helps you to build better models, and better models are good because it helps you predict the future better and make actions that predict better outcomes, etc. So from, I think, even a very classical reinforcement learning perspective, even when all you care about is maximizing rewards, you could say that curiosity is still a good thing and exploration is still a good thing. But I think that curiosity might have a little bit more than that. I think that's probably a large part of curiosity. But I think we might also have some curiosity sort of baked into us again, even in cases where it doesn't really seem adaptive, at least on the short term. And there are some interesting monkey experiments where they got some empirical evidence for that, where they told monkeys, or they didn't tell them, they engaged monkeys in an experiment where they learned that that they could get reward. And what they could sometimes do is also like trade a little bit of reward for getting some advanced information about whether they were getting a reward or not. And even though that advanced information was completely not helping them to obtain more reward, because it's just told them whether they were going to get it or not, they were willing to trade quite a bit of primary reward. So, the reward that they were actually interested in, you would think, just to get that information. And also the information itself sort of activated a nucleus in the brain that is usually quite associated with reward prediction errors. So as if sort of like getting information itself was rewarding to the monkeys.
Hold this thought. I just a like small comment. It's very similar to social media. When you open social media, not necessarily you will get something like exciting. Like exciting, like a message from your friend or like some exciting, post to read. But that anticipation of something exciting, like this is what prompts you to actually keep opening up all this like social media app and checking them. It's like what you're describing. It's like very similar, right? That anticipation of reward.
Absolutely, yeah. No, that is also like one of the accounts of why we are curious about information, so that we are trying to or that we enjoy savoring sort of this expected reward that will follow later. So I think that could definitely be part of it. At the same time, I think we are also curious about all kind of stuff that is not directly linked to rewards, right? I mean, with social media, you're right. You could say that it still has some kind of like positive feeling, but we also are curious about the news, which often doesn't have a very positive valence, or you have things like morbid curiosity, where people are curious about things that are very unpleasant even and aversive. So I think curiosity is probably really a complex beast, sort of, maybe is a desire for information that in itself can also have, again, multiple drivers. Like some of it might be just to feel good, and that's why we are more curious about positive than negative information. But there might also be just this kind of really strong desire to reduce uncertainty, irrespective of what that uncertainty pertains to.
That's why I reading like geopolitical news to understand also.
Yeah.
To reduce where this world is going.
Yeah. It also usually gives us a sense of control, right? If we feel like we understand it better, that we have this illusion of control, I think, that we then are maybe better able to engage with it and create a better situation for ourselves.
Please continue with the monkeys. I just like interrupted you.
So I think I mentioned all there is to say there. So these monkeys, they sacrifice quite a bit of primary rewards just to get this advanced information about whether they get a reward. So that I found quite fascinating because from an economic perspective, that's really not how you sort of should behave, normatively speaking. But nevertheless, they do. And I think this also is something that we see a lot in humans. So humans, if you would put them, if you would give them a choice sort of between two machines and one has a higher payoff than the other, you would expect maybe that people will just go all the time for the machine that has higher payoff. but usually they don't. They kind of like, they will go for the machine with higher payoff more often, but they'll keep sampling from both options. And that might just be because, you could say they cannot help but be curious. But there, I guess you could also frame this in a more adaptive way by saying that we just never assume that things are stable, and we keep wanting to sort of explore the environment to kind of like keep learning about it, so that we can also quickly adapt if contingencies change.
If we like deeper into like curiosity is just constant sampling of different options to build more comprehensive world model and like prediction, like how we could
conceptualize curiosity as a drive, I think, just like hunger is a drive. So hunger, of course, incentivizes you to find something to eat and to consume because you're hungry. I think curiosity sort of incentivizes you to explore and to build sort of like a better model. So, but in that sense, I think it is not just like when you're hungry, you don't go like eat anything, right? You don't go and eat grass or something. You usually, of course, go for something that is nutritious. And I think there the analogy also works in the sense that we don't just sample everything equally, but we sample information that we expect sort of to learn a lot from. So that I think there is a researcher, Yves Oreiller from France, who has this interesting notion that your sampling policy should kind of benefit learning progress. And I think that makes a lot of sense. So that you're not just curious about anything, but you're typically curious about things that you're uncertain about. But by sampling the information, you will become less uncertain about the sort of like, the cause, you could say, or the model that gives rise to the observation. Don't know if that's too abstract, but
intelligent sampling, right?
Yes,
so
exactly.
If I have
intelligent
uncertainty about a certain thing, like it's not like about everything, like certain subject, and then I'm like intelligently sampling to minimize that uncertainty.
And to come back to our eye movements, I think eye movements are doing exactly that. They're also intelligently sampled inputs, which maximally reduce our uncertainty about the things that we care about. So it's not just uncertainty about anything, of course. I might be uncertain about things in the periphery, but if I don't care about it, I won't move my eyes to those regions.
And we care about is it because like we need to survive, we need to propagate ourselves?
Yeah.
Is it like that motivation? Well, how we choose what we should care about?
I guess indeed, ultimately, our genes care about reproduction. Whether we as agents, I think, probably to some extent as well. But I do feel that drive sort of much less acutely than I feel the drive to, for example, the more immediate motivations, such as to try to understand the other person I'm talking to, or to perceive the world around me. So I think, what motivates sampling is typically, I guess, what you could call like your goals. But those goals, I guess, can again be defined on a variety of levels, right? So at a more proximal level, the goal could be, again, to have a good conversation or to learn something. But then at a more distal level, why do we want to learn anything at all, right? I guess probably you could probably construct sort of like motives at again, different time scales here as well.
I mean, if we try to sort of translate this to machines, basically, like if we like design like research, then we should think of like what machines should care about. Right?
Yeah.
And then like how they can, depends on what they should care about, how they can intelligently sample that data that is provided to them.
That's true. Yeah. At the same time, I mean, I think that, as I was already sort of struggling to verbalize, what goals are in a certain moment, I do think that often, we don't want to sample or we don't want to optimize the sampling process with a single goal in mind, I think. And so it might actually be adaptive to not have a very specific goal that would dictate sort of the sampling policy, but rather a sort of like a more unconstrained sampling policy. So that, again, I think this is also something that falls out of the research by Yves Aurier, where he finds that that machines that are just kind of have the policy of reducing their surprise over time, that actually seems a pretty good learning policy. So they are not kind of instructed to learn very specific things, but rather just to sample the world or to adapt their sampling to the degree that they are that their surprise gradient kind of, or the steepness of their surprise gradient. And what ends up happening with such a policy is that if something that you sample is very surprising, but as much as you keep sampling it, it remains very surprising, such as like white noise or something, you will stop sampling that because there's basically nothing to learn, right? It was weird and it remains weird. At the same time, if you sample something that you fully understand, so then sampling it again will also not reduce your surprise because there was no surprise to begin.
You already know about
Exactly.
it.
So that, again, is an area of the exploration landscape that you will avoid, right? Because there's, again, nothing to learn. The steepness of this gradient of the prediction error decline is then turns out to be a pretty nice way to get machines to be curious and sort of sample the world in an undirected way. And I think that's is still quite important, I think, because in the end, we also, our perception, it subserves so many functions. It's not just for categorization, but it's also for our actions. It's for it subserves many forms of understanding, etc. And we don't want our system to be geared too specifically, I think, towards one goal. That, I think, could be a mistake.
Do you have any biases towards what like any consciousness theory that you support, or even like just studying human brain? Have you ever thought of like how it corresponds to, our understanding of consciousness?
I'm generally quite a fan of the late Daniel Dennett and so his view on consciousness, which is quite a materialist functionalist view. So it's materialist in the sense that it's a product of the brain. And I think that's maybe something that most people will agree on. So to start on the simple part, I think consciousness is, I would say, generated by the brain. I actually recently learned that not everybody thinks this. There is this recent book by Dan Brown. I don't know if you know it, or maybe even have read it, The Secret of Secrets. And there, consciousness is cast as this kind of signal that is out there and that the brains are sort of receiving like a radio. I think that's complete nonsense. So I think the consciousness is really something that happens, is a product of our brain. And I think also, and that may be a little bit more contentious already, that it's a function that is kind of emerged similarly to how perception or memory has emerged. So it's kind of an emergent phenomenon that we experience and that we can describe. And it's kind of created by the orchestrated activity of many individually dumb neurons. So that's sort of maybe I think most neuroscientists would agree with this. So they would say there's no ghost in the machine. But then a little bit more specifically, I think I like the idea of consciousness maybe as some form of global availability, so that it's a function that just maybe a little bit like, as I was talking about the eye, like where like moving your eye around is not a bug but a feature, so that you can like focus in on like specific input and make the computation a lot more straightforward. I think the same might happen sort of internally. So where consciousness is sort of our internal eye that allows us to kind of inspect only a small part of all the parallel information processing that is going on. And I think this aligns with theories like global workspace that Bernard Baars has put forward, and its neurovariant that Stanislas de Haan has been advocating. So, but I think what is maybe some disappointing to some in this framework is that I think consciousness is there not so mysterious. It's just a specific type of information processing. And then I think what we need to figure out still, of course, are exactly the features of it and its neural implementation. But I think once we have explained that, just like perception or attention or memory or any of these other functions, I don't think there will be anything left to explain once we have explained that. And I think it's, of course, still a difficult problem. I mean, we don't understand perception or attention in detail either, but I don't think it's necessarily much more difficult or orders of magnitude more difficult than that.
I mean, the challenge that usually, like scientists or like point out that it's because it's like a subjective experience, like how you can measure it.
There are like already very old experiments by Penfield, for example, that show that also without breaking the brain, you can simply stimulate specific ensembles of neurons and generate specific conscious experiences, right? So which are tied to which specific cells you are stimulating. So that tells me that there is, of course, some mapping between the activity of specific areas and a conscious experience related to what those areas are processing. Now, then, of course, you haven't explained yet then why sometimes activation in that area is associated with conscious experience, whereas in other situations it's not. So I think there are obviously many parts of the brain we know we can activate without it leading to conscious experience. But at the same time, we also have already some clues about like what are then the differences between an activation that is not associated with conscious experience and an activation in that same area that is associated with conscious experience, related to the duration of the activation, related to maybe the recurrence of information processing. So I think there are some kind of like motifs that are shared by some contemporary theories of consciousness that that we're reaching some consensus on. So in that sense, I think ultimately the mystery will kind of disappear. I think once we'll explain sort of like how sort of like each of these different parts contribute to the emergent phenomena, which is the experience. I think once we've explained all that, then I think we're done. I don't think there's anything left to explain. But that obviously contrasts vehemently with people like Dave Chalmers that cast this as the easy problem, and they say, well, there's this hard problem that once you've explained everything, you still have this qualia, or you still have this experience. I think I'm with Dennett on that one. I don't think there's anything left to explain once you have explained all the functions of consciousness. I think the hard problem is a bit of a pseudo problem, and it's this experience is basically just part of the information processing. It's the brain having a model of itself, and I think it's very interesting that we can do that. Of course, that we can build not just models of the world, but also a model of ourselves. But at the same time, I don't think it's necessarily mysterious.
How we can move towards that? Like, let's put hard problem on a side, and like if we tackle like easy problem and from functional perspective try to describe, right, this.
I think this field, sort of the neural correlates of consciousness, it's sometimes called, I think it has made some progress, but I also feel that it's not made as much progress as we all hoped. Maybe to start with progress, I think in the early days, there was this paper by, I believe it was Crick and Koch, where they postulated that maybe the claustrum could be sort of the seat of consciousness, like a particular area that was very well connected to the rest of the brain. I think by now there is no one that believes that anymore. So that's progress, right? So we are falsifying some hypothesis.
We're like, hit the dead end. Okay, yeah, that's a problem. Like,
a good idea at the time, maybe, but but I think maybe more generally, I don't think anybody believes that there is kind of like one part where the magic happens. So there's no sort of seat of consciousness. And this is kind of akin to most cognitive functions. There's also no one part where perception happens or where language happens.
So like perception happens in like all part of the brain like involve to form the perception?
All is maybe an overreach. I don't think the primary auditory cortex is involved in visual perception, but there is a surprisingly large amount of areas involved in it. Yeah, so I think depending on which animal you look at and how generous you are, some people would say between 30 to 50% of the brain is involved in some part of perception. But you could probably make a similar case for language, and the reason is that these are like cognitive modules that have reality for us, or that are meaningful labels when we're trying to describe the mind. But the mind is kind of an emergent phenomenon of the interaction of many sort of like areas and neural ensembles within the brain, right? So that's why language doesn't happen in a specific place, or it's the emergent property from the orchestrated activity over time of groups of neurons. And I think the same is true for consciousness. So that's why it doesn't have a specific seat. It also doesn't have a specific moment or a specific, it's basically just a process that is continuously happening. And that is so I don't think that if people are looking for an answer in terms of like, oh, that's where it is, yeah, then I think they'll be disappointed. I don't think we'll ever find that. But if we're happy with an explanation in terms of like, okay, if we have this ensemble of neurons that we all connect up in this specific way and with this specific type of information processing, then consciousness will emerge. Yeah, that I think will be the final answer, or no, final. I guess we never have final answers, but that would be an answer I would be satisfied with.
But what about like other species who are not mammals, but are still considered to be conscious beings, right? How to explain that emerging, what is it, like emergent behavior in those kind of species?
I think consciousness actually, I mean, even though I kind of used it in a bit of a unitary sense now, will ultimately then have to be split up into, for example, something like self-consciousness, which is sort of that you're aware of yourself and the fact that you have thoughts, etc., all those kind of things. But you also have, of course, much more rudimentary forms of consciousness, for example, like just visual consciousness, right? That you are aware of a stimulus in front of you. Now, I think those kind of like more rudimentary forms of consciousness, I think we definitely share with other mammals. The degree to which we share that with even simpler species, I think it depends a little bit on the degree to which they have an internal model of the sensory world around them. I think if they do, I would expect them to have sort of like sensory consciousness, let's say, consciousness of the visual world around them, for example. So yeah, but of course not all information processing itself is necessarily conscious, right? So so I think the ability to kind of react to stimuli, I wouldn't kind of immediately pin that down as like, okay, this animal or being is conscious of that information. Let's take the Breitenberg machine again, where you just have like wheels and light sensors, and you just connect the light sensors to the wheels. I mean, it behaves as if it's kind of, for example, afraid of light, right? Or if it's attracted to light, depending on how you wire up the wheels to the light sensors. I would find it a stretch to say that it has kind of like an internal model of like light sources, etc. So I would not say that the Breitenberg machine is consciously aware of the light in front of it.
In my recent conversation, I learned that trees react on anesthesia. And when you mentioned that forming that sensory model of the world, like maybe you don't even need to have like vision, or like but like you still can this internal representation of the world. I don't know, maybe trees, maybe like plants, they might have it, right? Like if they react on anesthesia and they have like such a rich underground, like communication with each other, maybe somehow they also actually generate that awareness of the environment. It's just like very different awareness from human, but they still like have that capacity to do it.
It's a difficult problem, right? I mean, as you mentioned yourself, it's very difficult to know. So I guess it's even hard for any human to know whether any of the other humans that surround this human have the same experiences, right? Or whether they have the same level or type of consciousness. So it's because it's really, for us anyway, sort of consciousness is really something that is us sort of inspecting our own models. So can trees do that? I would be fairly skeptical, given that the type of information processing that goes on in trees, I believe, is much more rudimentary. And I think there was even, some people have, I believe, posited that trees may engage in some form of like associative learning, but I think the evidence for that. I'm not a plant biologist, so I'm a bit out of my outside of my wheelhouse here. But I don't know how compelling the evidence for that already is. So, and I think in order to really build a model that you can then sort of, on the basis of which you can generate predictions and then kind of interact with sensory environment in that way, I have never heard of any of that in trees. So that's why my hunch would be that there is no consciousness in the way that we understand consciousness in something like a tree. But that's definitely, if we move away from humans, it's very difficult to know how a bat experiences something, or any animals. So we can make a guess, but we can never really know, I think.
So what's your take on consciousness in machines?
I don't see why not. Yeah, I think we are a machine that is made out of meat. And why would a machine that is made of different stuff not be able to be conscious, right? I think some people that are so certain that machines cannot be conscious are maybe a bit too human-centric. So in a sense that maybe that's also the reason why they think animals may not have consciousness, etc. So I think it's hard to know, but I don't see any kind of principled argument why it could not be possible. So, and I think even sort of sometimes people say like, well, machines don't have a global neuronal workspace like we do, or they don't have recurrent architectures like we do. But I find that argument also only medium compelling, because in a sort of a computational view, I guess consciousness is some kind of function that emerges out of a specific type of computation. But I don't, even just like it doesn't have to be implemented in meat, it can be implemented in silicon. I think the same can be said for like the specific neural architecture that we have, right? If you would build a different architecture that has different type of connectivity, but ultimately performs the same type of computation, why would it matter? So I think that's why I'm also not that compelled by arguments that are looking at kind of specific neural implementation and say like, well, because the implementation is different, the computation cannot be the same.
So do you think like by better understanding the function of consciousness in humans, we might also use it to translate to machines as well, right? To some extent.
Yeah, I think and that's again, maybe sort of a motif that repeats here. So just like when I was talking about perception, where I think that we could maybe enhance our perception by making these models more active hypothesis testers and really not just letting them chew on input and try to understand that input, but to really understand input by actively testing hypotheses. I think that a similar motif might sort of create sort of more consciousness in a sense when you are not just sampling and making hypotheses about input, but you're doing the same, but now pertain to your internal states, basically. So where you are, when it becomes sort of thinking rather than perceiving.
Basically, we can, like, with more advancement in AI research, we might like really end up with that emergent behavior in machines, right? That they can build that sort of like internal representation of the world. I'm biased towards AI consciousness. That's why I'm not like providing arguments against it, because those other arguments don't work on me. So it would be like silly to argue. But I'm just thinking, like, if we trying to translate human perception to AI, right? If we're trying to translate reasoning to AI, why, like, if we're basically trying to bring all these like functions that humans have to machine, even if they work differently in machine, why we should rule out, possibility that also like consciousness can emerge, right? As a result. of this.
I think we're on the same team. Yeah, I totally agree with you on this one. That's, I guess, maybe also a bit of a scary thought, because I guess we often, it raises potential moral dilemmas, right? Which people have raised repeatedly in the past.
You mean how to treat machines?
Exactly. Yeah. I think it's so that's my. If we can avoid it, I guess it might be better to avoid generating consciousness in machine. But then again, given that we don't have like good consciousness meters, it's difficult to it's difficult to do this compellingly. But maybe to the degree that we'll understand better, like what are the exact features of that generate consciousness, I would advocate sort of like not building. Not necessarily building that. If you can get to function without consciousness, it would be better.